If you feel technology innovation is overwhelming, you're not alone. Before the pandemic, we were already racing towards possible futures of AI and cryptography and drones and chatbots and genetic editing and more. But a year or more of remote working, global economic disruption, and a medical crisis have accelerated some of these changes and given a new spin to others. Gideon Lichfield is the global editorial director of Wired and previously headed up MIT Technology Review, two publications that for decades have charted the rise of the internet and technology in general. So we thought we'd ask Gideon to join us to ask him some questions about what technology trends he's seeing, which ones are overrated, and perhaps most importantly, how people's behavior will or won't change in response. Please give a very warm Forward 50 welcome to Gideon Lichfield. Hi, Gideon.
Alistair, how are you? It's good to see you.
I'm very well, thanks. Are you coming from the East Coast or the West Coast today?
From the West Coast. Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry to get you up so early.
I might be slightly less sparkling than normal.
It's great to see you again. You saw a bit of Forward 50 last year and obviously have changed jobs since then and changed coasts since then. What do you think is going on right now with all this change? And we talked about a few things before, so I'll give you a little tee up here. When we talked about the transformation of technology and obviously the news that we're seeing right now around all the major technology superpowers kind of being under scrutiny for their policies and their backroom dealings, it seems like there's a battle here between regulating tech companies or building incentives into government and how they work. And you mentioned Ford and what happened around Ford and seatbelts and some other legislation around the automotive industry, and Facebook as parallels for what regulation and the resistance of corporations to that regulation looks like. I didn't know that much about the Ford example. Can you clarify that a bit?
So what I was citing was we ran an article by Mar Hicks a few weeks ago talking about what happens in the typical cycle with regulation of big industries. And basically the example was the auto industry in the beginning created these products that people really wanted, cars. And there was huge demand for them, but there was also a lot of pollution problems and safety problems because the industry was very lightly regulated. And the car companies basically for a while trod all over regulators and all over the government because they said, look, people want our products. You can't limit what we do. And it seemed very hard to counter that argument. But then over time, public pressure built for safer cars. And eventually we got seatbelts, we got emission standards, and we got all sorts of things that brought the industry into line and put pay to the argument that you can't shut down an industry that people want, or you can't limit its power because people want the products that it makes. So the argument that Mar Hicks was making was, look, we're going to see something similar when it comes to the social media giants. At the moment, they're saying, look, we produce these platforms, these services that everybody really wants. We are just giving them the things that they like, where our algorithms are responding to people's desires and needs. We can't possibly limit free speech, so there's very little you can do. And besides, we're already doing everything we possibly can to make these platforms safer for everyone. And that argument, Mar argues, is going to slowly lose steam, and regulation will come in. So I guess for me, though, the question is, what does that regulation look like? Because I think the problem is, you talked about incentives versus regulation. So these companies have an incentive right now to produce social media platforms that maximize the engagement of their users. And the incentives that they have to do that include the fact that they have to report quarterly earnings, that they make their money off advertising, and therefore that they make the most money and do best in their earnings when most people spend the most time on their platforms. It's very hard to change that incentive system. But I don't think that you can achieve changes to the influence that these companies have by simply passing laws on limiting free speech, because regulation takes a long, long time to catch up to changing norms about what is good speech or what's bad speech, right? We couldn't have predicted vaccine misinformation. We couldn't have predicted QAnon a few years ago. Lawmakers can't keep up with that kind of stuff. I think you also can't rely on the platforms themselves to limit speech. In fact, I don't think you want to. You don't want Facebook setting policy on what is acceptable speech. The Facebook papers that have come out over the last few months, one of the things they've shown is that, in fact, even Facebook itself is only removing maybe 3 to 5% of hate speech on its platform, according to its own employees. So limiting or curbing what they do, it's not very clear how that works. Breaking them up, well, I think that there's an argument that if you break up the platforms, all you end up with is a bunch more platforms that have free speech problems.
You just balkanize things, yeah.
Right, exactly. So, so what do? You have to somehow change the incentive structure, and what does that look like? I think that's the question that we haven't answered yet. But I think we need. So, what I'm hoping, I suppose, is that at some point over the next few years, we're going to see platforms emerging that think about a different way to give value to their users. Something that is less about the short-term gratification and more about the long-term value. And you know, the time well spent movement that started out here in the Bay Area is one example of a viewpoint on how you could change the incentive structure, how you could try to maximize for time that people consider they spent well on a platform rather than the length of time they spent on the platform. But you know, the question is, how do you get people to value that? Maybe it's about having people pay for services instead of giving them things for free. But I don't think we've got the answer to this yet. But it does seem to me clear that we have to change the incentive structure for these companies.
It certainly seems like we're looking at the sort of reptile brain, you know, what triggers you low down on the sort of self-actualization scale features. We're not saying, you know, did this discussion make society better? We're just saying, did it make you angry?
Yes.
We're down in the reptile brain still, and moving up is going to be hard because, like it or not, that's how humans seem to be wired.
And it's also really difficult, I think, to regulate something like a social media company compared with a car company, because a car company, you know, you can see the causal connection to the harm that is caused when a car crashes, right? Or when it produces a certain amount of pollution. It's really much harder to measure and to create the causal link between, you know, all of this stuff was happening on Facebook and that led to a revolution or to riots or whatever it was. Or a
teenage girl killing herself. I mean, yeah, absolutely. I'm taking notes because, as you probably guessed, we're going to go off piste a little. Someone had a great point yesterday about the difference. No, I think it was on Tuesday. Mike Nelson said it's dangerous to use certain analogies. And one he cited was a car ownership versus data ownership. His point was, if I say that's my car, it's clearly my car. But if I have a photograph, that is a photograph of me. It may not be my photo, but it's a photo of me. And in the same way, we don't have our data. We have data about us. If I say I have a photograph.
No, I got that bit. Right. So what was the last thing you asked?
Oh, so are there better metaphors than cars when it comes to social media? Like what's a metaphor or an analogy that might help us think better about that kind of regulation or governance?
That's a great question. You've caught me off guard with that one. I don't know, but we should try to come up with one, because I think, as you say, talking about data ownership, I mean, there are certainly an argument that is made that we need better data ownership for people so they can have control over their data. But I think both the ownership and the control metaphors are wrong. And part of that is because it's simply impractical. There's no way we can keep tabs of what our data is doing. And I think that laws like GDPR that seek to give you notional control over your data by giving you the choice of what is shared, those don't actually end up protecting the user. All they do is they flood us with pop-ups, and they don't leave us better informed about where our data is. So, you know, I think that with data, we have to move away from the idea of ownership and control and towards something that helps us understand maybe what is a way to protect people against the harms that are caused when their data are used in a certain way, and focus on the harm reduction, if you like, or the redress, and not so much on the ownership.
Let's talk a bit about resiliency. Obviously, the pandemic has shown us a lot, and supply chain issues like the Suez Canal, about how resilient or brittle humans are. What are your thoughts these days on the ability of different social systems to respond to problems like climate change or cryptocurrency for better or for worse, now that you've seen us try and respond?
I mean, it's been really interesting over the pandemic to watch how different countries tackled it. And the thing that really struck me was how over the months, our expectations of which countries were doing well and which countries were doing badly kept on being upended. And it started to become clear that it wasn't that authoritarian countries did better and democracy did worse, or that big countries did better and smaller countries did worse, or vice versa. It had to do with a lot of very particular circumstances. Some of those included geography. If New Zealand did very well, Australia did well. Some of them had to do with the independence of public health authorities, regardless of whether it was a democratic or an authoritarian system. But I think what it taught us is that there is a lot of unpredictability there. One thing that for me is really striking, though, is that over the last few decades, we have gone from this kind of generalized assumption in the Western world that everything is tending towards the free market liberal democratic model to a position where that's not clear entirely anymore. And I think what we're going to be looking at over the next 50 years or so is a kind of grand experiment in the capabilities of China versus the US, really above all, to progress in the world, whether it's against climate change, whether it's in general social well-being, economic equality, whether it's in technological advances. We're going to see this enormous contrast between a very centralized, very powerful system in the case of China, and a system that in the US, I think, is moving towards increasingly blocked and sclerotic national government, but more and more agile and interesting experimentation at the local government level. And I'm really interested, I don't know how much more of those 50 years I'll be around, but I'm going to be very curious to see how that plays out.
One of the things I keep coming back to is that we need to return to very fundamental assumptions. The digital world, and the stats I've seen are we spend more than 6 non-working hours a day in this digital world, which some people are calling the metaverse, but let's call it the if you want to quote Thierry de Chardin, it's the noosphere, right? It's the objective content of thoughts we all share. It seems to me like the laws of physics are very different. So things that were abundant in the digital world and scarce in the physical world. Atom, if I have an atom, you can't have it. It's one only atom. If I make copies, they're infinite. Right. And so it seems like so is it the case that in a world of easy copying and hard veracity, capitalism is still the best engine of productivity, by which I mean advancement in technology, growth of GDP, and so on? How does that make you feel? Am I on a...
I mean, it's an interesting question. I think, capitalism, as you pointed out, depends on scarcity, which scarcity allows us to put a price on an object or on a thing. But I think what we see in a digital world is that the notion of things that can be scarce just changes. So there's always something that is scarce. The thing that we understood with the internet 10 or 15 or 20 years ago was that the scarce thing was no longer content. The scarce thing was attention. And the platforms that emerged figured out that they were monetizing our attention because our time is a scarce resource. So I feel like any capitalist system will orient itself naturally around whatever there is that is scarce. And there's always something that is scarce in a system. The other point to this is the emergence of things like NFTs is a really interesting, you could call it almost a natural evolution. Maybe it's driven by capitalism. The fact that we are a capitalist society and then we bring our capitalist values into digital space, you could argue made it almost inevitable that we would find a way to make digital assets be unique and scarce. And so the fact that for many people, it's incomprehensible why you would pay tens of thousands or even millions of dollars for a digital artwork that can be replicated perfectly in every pixel. That seems incomprehensible to us, but it's kind of almost an inevitability when you overlay a capitalist system, because we've invented a way to label something as scarce and put a value to it because that's a fundamental value, fundamental approach that we try to take with it. Yeah, and so it's, you and I talked about how difficult it is to predict what people will do with tech. I think that's a great example where no one could have told you that we would artificially invent a way to make a completely fungible object non-fungible, but that's what we did.
And let's return to that for a bit here. There's a huge gulf between what we think will matter versus what actually matters. I was talking to David Brin a couple of weeks ago, and he pointed out that Asimov once said his job was not to predict cars in science fiction, but rather to predict the traffic jams they cause, because that's the interesting thing. What are your thoughts about how good or bad we've been at figuring out what will matter versus what actually matters? Is it driven by the systems like capitalism, or by adoption? You've been studying these kinds of things through an economic and technology lens.
I mean, I think we've been lousy, honestly, at figuring out what will matter to people. You know, a great example is the internet itself, and how when it was getting off the ground in the 90s, which is when Wired was born, we kind of assumed that making information freely and widely available would lead to more liberal values, to more democracy around the world. And we, didn't take account of how people would actually want to use this thing. I think we've tended to assume that democratizing technologies in general levels the playing field, but instead it turns out that the power structures, power imbalances that exist in society reassert themselves through those new technologies. Zeynep Tufekci, the sociologist, wrote in something that she wrote for MIT Technology Review when I was there, something to the effect of power always learns. What she meant was that a new disruptive technology may start out as being in the hands of people and can be used for some kind of democratizing effect. But powerful institutions always catch up in the end and learn to use that technology for their own purposes. So I feel like to get back to your question, I think that we have tended to make predictions about what people will do using the tools like economics and political science. And maybe what we really need is to do it more using tools like Zeynep Tufekci does, which is tools of sociology, of ethnography, of understanding people's basic motivations, because that's what lets you understand why someone would turn a seemingly worthless piece of a digital file into a work of art that can cost millions of dollars. That sort of prediction can't really come about unless you understand at a deeper level the motivations that people have that don't seem to be rational, but in fact drive the way that we act.
Well, going back to Asimov's quote, I remember seeing the pictures of early cars that had a young boy with a red flag walking in front of them because they were toys for the rich.
Right.
I've used the analogy that an NFT is much more like the Beanie Baby tag. So it's not the actual stuffed toy, it's the little tag that proves its authenticity, which you might then be able to access Webkins with. And one of my favorite examples was there's a woman who's an Instagram OnlyFans star who made 100 burlesque NFTs of herself and said, if you have this NFT, you can join me in a private chat room whenever you want.
Right.
Now, if her value goes up in price, that NFT becomes an investment, but it is actually a credential. It's a decentralized credential, and there's no third party. When I get a university degree, the university institutions that have certified that university allow an employer to know I have those abilities. It seems like decentralizing credentialing is a much more interesting thing. So if NFTs might start out as silly toys for the rich, but all of a sudden we have a good distributed credentialing system. Mm-hmm. And so to me, the question about how things change from what we thought their intended use was to how we then pervert them into something that is actually useful under the new circumstances is the hardest part to hack.
I mean, I might push back on you a little bit about that, because I would ask simply, what makes decentralized credentialing interesting? Credentialing is central to the way that art works in any case, right? When back before the internet, we have physical art objects, but provenance of an object is the thing that tells you this object is valuable, this object is the original, and ownership is also something that has to be credentialed. And so it was provenance was credentialed by art dealers and auction houses and other kind of guardians of authenticity. And ownership was credentialed by means of proof of sale, receipts, and so on. But regardless of the method of credentialing, what's important is that the credential exists. So my question to you is, what is it that changes when we decentralize it?
Yeah, that's why can't you just use a serial number is the best question I've heard asked of the blockchain.
Yes, and that's the question that I have on every blockchain application I come to, which is what can you do here with a blockchain that you can't do without one? And the blockchain devotees will hate me, but I have yet to come across a totally convincing answer to any of that. If anyone on the conference is listening and wants to prove to me that their idea of about a blockchain application really uses a blockchain in a way that nothing else can, that can't be substituted by another technology, I'm really keen to hear it.
Sounds like you need to throw down some of those 100-year bets. So speaking of predicting, what assumptions did you have about the rational behavior of society, and what actually happened over the last couple of years? Like, how did rationality disappoint you?
Yes. Well, so at the very beginning of the pandemic, I wrote a piece that talked about what I thought was going to happen as we adapted to a long-running pandemic. It was right about the moment when it became clear that this wasn't going to be a thing of just, shut down for a few weeks, but that it was going to take potentially years until we had finally brought either eliminated the virus, or it had mutated out to some kind of relatively harmless endemic thing. And so what I said was in this piece, essentially, in order to live relatively normal lives, meaning to have the kind of freedom of movement that we had before, we're going to have to give up some things. And we're going to have to give up, in particular, a certain degree of privacy. The technologies that we're going to need in order to be able to live relatively normal lives, it was already becoming clear, they would include things like contact tracing, regular testing, restrictions on who could go where based on their risk level. China was already starting to do this at the time with its red, blue, and green color coding system that determined whether you could get onto public transport, for instance. And I said, this is going to spread. This is going to become the norm in the Western world. It's not great from many perspectives, but I predict that this is what people will agree to in order to retain the thing that is so precious to them, which is freedom of movement. And what I was wrong about, I think, were two things. One was I overestimated the capacity of governments and public health authorities to actually implement any of this stuff. So to this day in the United States, we have no real contact tracing operation. We have no real vaccine passport or other way of verifying vaccination status that isn't completely fragmented or easily gained. So the capacity of governments to implement this I completely overestimated it. But then the other thing I think overestimated was people's willingness to, I suppose I could say, to protect themselves. In other words, to many people, freedom of movement was more important even than not getting the virus. And really, I shouldn't have been surprised by that. And I think this came home to me when I went on a trip recently to London. So I've been living in between New York and California. People are still relatively careful. They mask up on the subways. You have to show a vaccine certificate to get into a restaurant. I went to London. Nobody gave it to us. People are riding on public transport unmasked. None of the pubs or restaurants was asking for vaccine proof. And within a couple of days, I found myself living in exactly the same way and not really caring myself. So the power, two things, that, A, how much we care about freedom of movement, and B, the power of our environment and the people around us to influence how we think, how we process what we consider rational decisions. That's far stronger than any actual rationality. On the brittleness question, I guess I don't actually think we're that brittle. I was trying to think back to what society was like, let's say in the Middle Ages. The Black Death wiped out a third of, by some estimates, a third of the population of Europe. And we cannot imagine a third of our population being wiped out today. But what happened in the wake of the Black Death was actually a flowering. We got, there was obviously a lot of disruption, a lot to society, but it also cleared out some, if you like, some stagnation in the economy. Living standards actually went up across much of Europe. Over time, we got the Reformation and the Renaissance. It helped break down the feudal system. So that shakeup actually loosened a lot of things that were holding society back. Obviously, at enormous cost of human life. If we were to lose a third of the population today, it is, on the one hand, it's inconceivable and it's hard to imagine how society would keep functioning. But I suppose the lesson I take is that we are actually pretty resilient and we do find ways to adapt. And even the pandemic itself is, I think, a good example of that, because I think if you had told any of us a year and a half ago that we were going to spend, or a lot of us, those who didn't have the kinds of jobs that force us to be in working environments, that a lot of us could spend a year or more working remotely, we'd have probably said, no, that's crazy. Then people won't stand for it. It won't be feasible. Companies will be unable to function. Workers will shirk off. None of that happened. Actually, things worked out really well. So, other disruptive events that we could imagine happening that are slightly less extreme than a pandemic that kills a third of the population. Well, Facebook going down as it did a couple of weeks ago. Massive hacks that bring down grid infrastructure, or break down telecoms or the internet for periods of time. I think all of those things, those can be very disruptive, but each of them will also teach us about the need for more resilience. And one result I think of the Facebook outages was that a lot of places where people really depend on Facebook and WhatsApp realize that they can't take these services for granted, and that they need to be able to have other forms of communication. So although it seems at one level as if we have to be much more brittle than we were in the Middle Ages because we rely on so much more of a technology stack than we did. On the other hand, I think that technology stack itself is made up of many layers, and when one layer breaks, we drop down to the next one. So I actually think that we remain relatively resilient.
We see whatever you're bringing up on.
So last question for you here.
So as you say, I think the modern republic arose as a result of the breakdown of authority, a delayed result of the breakdown of authority of the Catholic Church and monarchic institutions that happened in the wake of the Reformation and the printing press. And the republic arose really as a method for a society to achieve reliable ways of understanding the world, of creating knowledge, and then legitimizing that knowledge, making it publicly accepted, so that society could agree to take decisions, governance decisions, on the basis of reliable information. And the institutions that we developed for doing that include the media, and they include universities and schools and think tanks and professional bureaucracies and all sorts of other things like that are, as you said, the truth class. What I think is happening now is, we've seen that actually that truth class has not been as good as it thought it was at predicting certain things and at understanding the impact of certain events on many people's lives. And the internet, a bit like the printing press, has often been said, has helped contribute to that, because it's given many other actors a way to bring in their own perspectives and contradict the views of the truth class. So I suppose what I think has to happen is that maybe we're headed for a long-term slow breakdown in the authority of that truth class. I think that in the long term, something else arises to replace it, or some other method for society of arriving at consensus. In other words, at reliable knowledge about the world that enough people agree on that we can collectively take decisions about it. And obviously the internet is going to have its part to play in doing that. I'm very interested in models of governance that allow people to reach consensus, like the ones that Jamie was talking about just now. But I'm really curious about where those green shoots of new styles of governance or new forms of consensus are going to come from. Because at the moment, what I see is a truth class that's trying to defend itself and trying to keep up its role as the gatekeepers. And I'm not sure that strategy is going to succeed.
Scary thoughts, and I apologize for my audio. I know we're having issues on the back end. I think whether consensus emerges from like buttons or upvotes or what, it's really hard to tell, but there are certainly a lot of experiments being run concurrently, and it'll be fascinating in the coming years to see which ones they are. So thank you so much for being with us, Gideon. Really appreciate your insights. It's always fun to talk about this stuff.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thanks.